I stood in my living room, staring at a legal document that made my blood run cold. The paper trembled in my hands as I read the words that would haunt me for months to come. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had just sold 800 acres of my family's land to a development company, land that belonged to me, the land that my grandfather had passed down through 3 generations of our family. The worst part? They had done it 3 months ago while I was still grieving his death. They waited. They watched. They struck when they thought I was weakest. But as I looked out my window at the bulldozers already tearing through century-old oak trees on what should have been my property, I realized something that would change everything. They had no idea who they were dealing with. That was when I realized they had built their entire criminal empire on my land. 6 months earlier, I received the phone call that changed my life forever. My grandfather had passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a legacy that stretched across 1,500 acres of pristine wilderness in rural Tennessee. This was not just property. This was 3 generations of family history, carved into rolling hills and ancient forests that had sheltered our family through wars, economic hardship, and countless seasons of change. I remember the first time Grandpa walked me through these woods as a child. His weathered hands pointed out boundary markers carved into oak trees by his father decades before. Every creek, every meadow, every hidden trail held stories that connected me to something larger than myself. The mineral rights, the water access, and the untouched wilderness that modern development had never reached. It was freedom in its purest form. But something felt wrong from the moment I arrived to survey my inheritance. Modern surveyor stakes pierced the earth like tiny flags of invasion. The distant hum of machinery created an ominous soundtrack to what should have been peaceful solitude. Construction equipment sat parked along what I thought were my property lines, waiting like predators for the morning hunt to begin. The Willowbrook Estates community had been built 15 years ago, nestled against the southern border of our family land. Luxury homes with perfectly manicured lawns stretched in neat rows, each one worth more than most people make in 5 years. I had always viewed them as harmless neighbors, people who chose suburban comfort over the wild beauty that surrounded them. That perspective changed the moment I met Margaret Walsh. She appeared at my front door like a storm cloud dressed in designer clothing. Her perfectly styled silver hair and expensive jewelry spoke of authority and wealth, but her eyes held something darker, something calculating. "You must be the new landowner," she said, not bothering to introduce herself or offer condolences for my loss. "I am Margaret Walsh, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your little plot of land." Little plot, 1,500 acres of family legacy, and she called it a little plot. "I was hoping we could reach some kind of understanding," she continued, stepping into my home without invitation. "Your property creates certain complications for our community development plans." I should have recognized the threat hidden in her polite words. I should have understood that her visit was not a neighborly introduction, but a predator sizing up its prey. Instead, I offered her coffee and listened as she explained how my inheritance was somehow inconvenient for people who had chosen to live next to wilderness. The legal documents arrived 3 days later, official-looking papers that made no sense, filled with terms like abandoned property rights and tax lien authority. Claims against portions of my land that the HOA had somehow filed while my grandfather was still alive. Legal challenges that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. That night, I realized this was not going to be a simple property ownership situation. Margaret Walsh and her HOA had plans for my land, and they had been making those plans long before my grandfather passed away. They had been waiting, watching, preparing to strike the moment they thought I would be too overwhelmed by grief to fight back. They were wronged. The truth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I sat in my attorney's office, staring at documents that revealed the unthinkable. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had sold 800 acres of my land to Pinnacle Development Corporation 3 months ago. 800 acres that belonged to me, land that my family had owned for generations. How is this even possible? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My attorney, David Chen, had been practicing property law for 20 years. Nothing surprised him anymore. But as he spread the forged documents across his desk, even his experienced composure cracked. "This is fraud," he said simply. "Sophisticated, calculated fraud." The evidence was overwhelming. The HOA had created fake tax lien documents, claiming my grandfather had failed to pay property taxes that were never owed. They had filed false abandonment claims, suggesting the land had been unused and unclaimed for years. They had even forged my grandfather's signature on quitclaim deeds, transferring ownership to the HOA for back taxes and maintenance fees. Every document was a lie. Every signature was fake. Every legal claim was fabricated. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Margaret Walsh and the HOA board had been planning this theft for years. Bank records showed payments to private investigators who had been monitoring my grandfather's health and my family's financial situation. They had detailed reports on his medical appointments, his will, and his estate planning. They knew exactly when he would die, and they had positioned themselves to strike immediately. The development company had already begun clearing trees and preparing foundations for luxury homes. Century-old oaks that had stood since before my grandfather was born were being cut down to make room for McMansions built on stolen land. The sound of chainsaws echoing across what should have been pristine wilderness became the soundtrack of violation. I drove to the construction site that afternoon, my hands shaking with rage as I watched bulldozers tear through earth that held the footprints of my childhood. The foreman, a thick-set man in a hard hat, looked annoyed when I approached. "You need to leave," he said without looking up from his clipboard. "This is private property." "This is my property," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He laughed. "Not according to my permits. Pinnacle Development owns this land fair and square. Bought it from the HOA 3 months ago." Fair and square, as if theft could ever be fair. That evening, I confronted Margaret Walsh at her luxury home in the heart of Willowbrook Estates. She answered the door with the same smug confidence I had seen during our first meeting, but something had shifted in her expression. She knew I had discovered the truth. "I suppose you think you have some kind of case," she said, not bothering to invite me inside. "But property law is complicated. Sometimes ownership is not as clear as people think." "There is nothing complicated about this," I replied. "You stole my land, you forged documents, you committed fraud." Her laugh was cold and calculating. "Prove it. Take it to court. See how that works out for a grieving family member against an established community organization with unlimited legal resources." She was wrong about my resources, but more importantly, she was wrong about my determination. As I walked away from her front door that night, I made a decision that would change everything. Margaret Walsh and her criminal enterprise had declared war against my family. They had chosen the wrong enemy. The legal battle was about to begin. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this conspiracy went and how many other families had suffered the same violation. Because something told me that my 800 acres were not the only land that had been stolen by the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. The hunt for justice was just beginning. The courthouse became my second home as I filed lawsuit after lawsuit against the criminal enterprise that had stolen my family legacy. Fraud charges against the HOA, illegal sale reversal demands against Pinnacle Development, emergency injunctions to stop construction on my stolen land. Each filing felt like a small victory against an enemy that had underestimated my resolve and overestimated their cleverness. But Margaret Walsh and her HOA board fought back with the viciousness of cornered animals. They hired the most expensive law firm in the state, Klein, Morrison and Associates, known for crushing individual property owners in favor of corporate interests. Their legal strategy was simple: exhaust my finances and break my spirit through endless motions, depositions, and procedural delays. The harassment began immediately. HOA security guards started patrolling the borders of my remaining land, taking photographs and filing trespassing reports whenever I approached the construction site. Anonymous complaints were filed with the county, claiming I was operating illegal businesses, violating zoning laws, and creating environmental hazards on my property. The smear campaign spread through Willowbrook Estates like wildfire. Margaret Walsh held emergency community meetings, telling residents that I was a troublemaker trying to steal land that the HOA had purchased in good faith. According to her version of events, I was a greedy family member trying to overturn legitimate property transactions because I was unhappy with my inheritance. The lies were so elaborate that some residents believed them. I would see the suspicious glances when I drove through their neighborhood to reach my property. Whispered conversations would stop when I entered local businesses. The community that had once seemed like peaceful suburban neighbors transformed into hostile territory where I was viewed as the aggressor rather than the victim. But the most infuriating part was that construction continued despite my legal filings. Pinnacle Development claimed they had purchased the land in good faith and could not be held responsible for the HOA's fraudulent sale. Their lawyers argued that stopping construction would cause irreparable financial harm to an innocent third party. 800 acres of family wilderness disappeared tree by tree, day by day, while my lawsuits crawled through a legal system that seemed designed to protect corporations over individuals. The sound of chainsaws and bulldozers became a constant reminder that justice delayed was justice denied. Margaret Walsh's visit to my home 3 weeks into the legal battle was the final insult. She arrived with a briefcase and the casual confidence of someone who believed money and connections could overcome truth and law. "This has gone on long enough," she said, settling into my living room without invitation. "I am here to offer you a reasonable settlement that will benefit everyone involved." Her generous offer was insulting beyond belief. The HOA would graciously return 200 acres of my stolen land in exchange for my agreement to drop all legal claims and accept their ownership of the remaining 600 acres. They would even throw in $50,000 for my trouble. 200 acres, I repeated, letting the absurdity sink in. Out of the 800 you stole. "Business is business," she replied with a shrug. "This offer will not be repeated. Take it now or continue wasting your money on lawyers who cannot give you what you want." I walked to my front door and held it open. "Get out of my house." Her expression shifted from confident negotiation to cold threat. "You are making a mistake. We have resources you cannot imagine. We will bury you in legal fees until you have nothing left." As her expensive car disappeared down my driveway, I realized that Margaret Walsh had just confirmed everything I suspected about her character and her tactics. This was not about property disputes or community development. This was about a predator who had built a criminal enterprise on the suffering of others. The rejection of her settlement offer marked a point of no return. This battle would be decided by law, not by backroom deals or intimidation tactics. Margaret Walsh was about to learn what happened when ordinary people refused to surrender to institutional bullying. The war was just beginning. The investigation began with a simple question. If they could steal from me, who else had they victimized? The answer came through a private investigator named Sarah Martinez, a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases. What she uncovered over the next 6 weeks would transform a property dispute into the exposure of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Margaret Walsh was not just a power-hungry HOA president. She was the mastermind of a systematic scheme to acquire surrounding properties through fraud, intimidation, and corruption. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had been targeting landowners for over 8 years, using the same tactics that had been used against my family. The pattern was always the same. Elderly property owners would be monitored for signs of illness or financial distress. The HOA would file false tax lien claims and abandonment notices while the owners were distracted by medical emergencies or family crises. Legal documents would be forged, signatures would be faked, and property would be transferred to the HOA for pennies on the dollar. Sarah found 7 other families who had lost land to the Willowbrook Estates conspiracy. The Hendersons had lost 40 acres of farmland while caring for their son, who had been injured in military service. The Kowalskis had lost their family cabin and 25 acres during a bitter divorce that left them unable to afford legal representation. The Martinez family had lost 80 acres after the father suffered a stroke and could not navigate the complex legal challenges the HOA created. Each story followed the same playbook. Each family had been isolated, overwhelmed, and ultimately defeated by an enemy with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. Some had tried to fight back, but individual families could not match the coordinated legal assault that Margaret Walsh had perfected over nearly a decade. The financial connections were even more damaging. Bank records showed that Margaret Walsh owned a 40% stake in Pinnacle Development Corporation, the same company that had purchased my stolen land. She had been selling property to herself, using HOA funds to finance the fraudulent purchases, and then profiting from the development of stolen land. The money trail was staggering. Over 8 years, the conspiracy had generated more than $12 million in illegal profits. HOA dues and special assessments from Willowbrook Estates residents had been used to fund crimes against their neighbors. The people Margaret Walsh was supposed to serve had unknowingly financed her criminal enterprise. But the corruption reached even deeper. 3 members of the County Planning Commission had received substantial payments from shell companies connected to Margaret Walsh. Building permits for stolen land had been expedited without proper legal review. Environmental impact studies had been waived or falsified. The entire system had been corrupted to enable systematic theft. The smoking gun came in the form of recorded phone conversations. Sarah had convinced one of the junior HOA board members, a man named Robert Chen, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Margaret Walsh's tactics, to wear a recording device during board meetings. The recordings were devastating. Margaret Walsh openly discussed the illegal tactics, bragged about the families they had defeated, and planned future targets based on detailed surveillance reports. In one particularly damning conversation, she laughed about my grandfather's death and predicted that his weak grandson would be too emotional to mount any serious legal challenge. "These people think they own land," she said during a recorded board meeting. "But ownership is just a piece of paper. We have better lawyers, more money, and stronger connections. We can make that paper worthless whenever we choose." The evidence was overwhelming. Fraud, conspiracy, theft, abuse of fiduciary duty, corruption of public officials. Margaret Walsh and her criminal enterprise had operated in darkness for years, confident that their victims would remain silent and isolated. But darkness cannot survive exposure to light. Armed with proof of systematic criminal activity, recorded confessions, and financial evidence of massive fraud, I prepared to bring down the entire network of corruption that had victimized my family and so many others. The other families deserved justice. The residents of Willowbrook Estates deserved to know how their dues had been stolen. The community deserved to understand how their trusted leaders had betrayed them for personal profit. Margaret Walsh had built her empire on the assumption that ordinary people would never have the resources or determination to challenge institutional power. She was about to learn how wrong that assumption could be. The counterattack was ready to begin. The transformation from victim to warrior happened in the basement of St. Mark's Community Center, surrounded by 7 families who had suffered the same violation that had been inflicted on me. We sat in folding chairs arranged in a circle, sharing stories that revealed the true scope of Margaret Walsh's criminal enterprise. Robert Henderson, whose family had lost their farm, spoke with quiet dignity about watching bulldozers destroy fields that had fed their livestock for 3 generations. Maria Kowalski wiped away tears as she described losing the cabin where her grandchildren had learned to fish and hunt. Each story added fuel to a fire of righteous anger that burned away any remaining doubt about the justice of our cause. "They counted on us being alone," I said, looking around the circle of faces that had found strength in unity. "They counted on us being afraid. They counted on us giving up. But we are not alone anymore." The class action lawsuit we filed the following Monday was more than legal strategy. It was a declaration of war against institutional bullying and systematic theft. David Chen had recruited 2 additional attorneys who specialized in complex fraud cases. Our legal team was small compared to the army of corporate lawyers that Margaret Walsh could afford, but we had something more powerful than money. We had the truth. The media attention began immediately. Local news stations picked up the story of families fighting against HOA corruption. Social media exploded with support from people who had experienced similar abuses from homeowner associations across the country. The story touched a nerve in communities where ordinary people felt powerless against the bureaucratic machinery designed to control their lives. Margaret Walsh's attempts to silence the growing movement only added fuel to a fire that had already begun to consume her carefully constructed empire of deception. Cease and desist letters arrived daily, threatening lawsuits for defamation, harassment, and interference with business operations. Her lawyers demanded that we stop talking to the press, stop organizing community meetings, and stop spreading false accusations about their client. Each threat was a confession of fear. Each legal filing revealed the desperation of an enemy who had finally realized the true scope of their miscalculation. But the most devastating weapon in our arsenal came from an unexpected source. Sarah Martinez had discovered a legal loophole in Tennessee property law that would allow us to challenge not just the fraudulent land sales, but the HOA's authority over their community properties. The law was complex, but the principle was simple. When an HOA uses community funds to commit crimes, individual homeowners can challenge the organization's right to govern their properties. If we could prove that Willowbrook Estates had been systematically defrauded by its leadership, we could petition the court to dissolve the HOA entirely. Margaret Walsh and her board members would lose their authority. Their power would evaporate. Their control over the community would be transferred to a court-appointed administrator who would oversee the return of stolen funds and property. But the strategy went deeper than legal technicalities. Working with David Chen, we developed a plan to use property law against the HOA board members personally. The same aggressive tactics they had used to steal land could be turned against their own homes and assets. If Margaret Walsh could forge documents to claim abandoned property rights, we could use legitimate legal processes to place liens on her luxury home. If she could manipulate tax law to steal family land, we could pursue court-ordered asset seizure to recover damages for her victims. If she could corrupt the legal system to serve her criminal enterprise, we could use that same system to deliver justice. The irony was perfect. The hunter would become the hunted. The prey would reveal teeth that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Margaret Walsh had spent years perfecting the art of using legal violence against innocent families. She had weaponized bureaucracy, corrupted institutions, and turned the very system designed to protect property rights into an instrument of theft. Now those same weapons would be turned against her with the precision of a surgeon and the force of a sledgehammer. She would learn what it felt like to have her security stripped away, her assets threatened, and her future placed in the hands of people who had no reason to show mercy. The counterattack was about to begin, and Margaret Walsh had trained us well. The gavel fell like thunder in Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom, packed with spectators who had waited years to witness this moment of reckoning. The ruling was comprehensive and devastating. The land sale was declared illegal and fraudulent. All construction on my stolen property would cease immediately. Pinnacle Development Corporation would be liable for damages and restoration costs. And most importantly, criminal fraud charges would be filed against Margaret Walsh and 3 other HOA board members. Margaret Walsh's face transformed from smug confidence to dawning horror as Judge Morrison read the decision that would strip away her freedom, her reputation, and her ill-gotten security. The woman who had terrorized families for nearly a decade sat frozen in her chair, finally understanding that her victims had found their voice and their strength. This court finds clear and convincing evidence of a criminal conspiracy to defraud property owners through systematic abuse of fiduciary duty, Judge Morrison continued. The defendants used their positions of trust to commit theft on a massive scale, violating the most fundamental principles of property law and community governance. The criminal charges hit like lightning strikes: fraud in the first degree, conspiracy to commit theft, abuse of fiduciary duty, corruption of public officials. Each count carried a potential prison sentence that would ensure Margaret Walsh spent her remaining years behind bars, stripped of the luxury and power she had built on the suffering of others. But the sweetest justice came through the poetic symmetry of property seizure. The same laws she had twisted to steal my land now became the instruments of her downfall. Her luxury home, purchased with funds stolen from the very people she was supposed to serve, was placed under court-ordered lien pending restitution to her victims. The irony was so perfect it felt like cosmic intervention. Standing outside the courthouse as Margaret Walsh was led away in handcuffs, I understood that true justice was not just about punishment. It was about restoration. It was about returning balance to a world that had been knocked off its axis by greed and arrogance. The other families wept with relief as their suffering was acknowledged and their losses calculated for full restitution. Robert Henderson would get his 40 acres back, plus damages for the crops that had been destroyed. The Kowalskis would reclaim their family cabin and receive compensation for 8 years of lost use. Every stolen acre would be returned. Every fraudulent transaction would be reversed. Pinnacle Development Corporation faced a financial disaster that would likely bankrupt the company. Not only were they required to abandon the luxury home project built on stolen land, but they were also liable for environmental restoration of the 800 acres they had damaged. Century-old trees could not be replaced, but the company would fund a conservation easement that would protect the land from future development. The dissolution of the Willowbrook Estates HOA sent shockwaves through communities across the state. Homeowners who had trusted their elected leaders with community funds and property oversight discovered that their dues had been financing crimes against their neighbors. The betrayal ran deeper than financial fraud. It was a violation of the social contract that holds communities together. But the most satisfying moment came when I legally acquired Margaret Walsh's luxury home through court-ordered asset forfeiture. The mansion that had been purchased with stolen HOA funds would now serve as headquarters for a legal aid foundation dedicated to helping families fight HOA abuse and property theft. Walking through rooms that had once been her sanctuary, I felt the weight of poetic justice settling into place. The foundation established in my grandfather's name would ensure that his legacy extended beyond family inheritance to become a shield for others facing similar predators. Margaret Walsh received a federal prison sentence of 12 years, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 8 years. Her co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement in the criminal enterprise. The 3 county officials who had accepted bribes were removed from office and faced their criminal charges. The financial restitution was staggering. More than $12 million in stolen funds and property would be returned to victims, with additional punitive damages that would ensure the criminals could never profit from their crimes. Margaret Walsh's assets, including her retirement accounts, investment properties, and luxury possessions, were liquidated to compensate the families she had victimized. The investigation expanded beyond Tennessee as federal authorities discovered similar HOA fraud schemes in 6 other states. Margaret Walsh's criminal enterprise had been part of a larger network of corruption that targeted vulnerable property owners across the region. My legal victory became the catalyst for a nationwide crackdown on HOA abuse that would protect countless families from similar predators. But the greatest victory was personal. My grandfather's land was restored in its entirety, protected by conservation easements that would preserve it for future generations. The wilderness that had sheltered our family for 3 generations would continue to stand as a monument to the principle that justice exists for those brave enough to demand it. Standing on the same hills where this story began, I realized that the person looking out over these rolling acres was not the same one who had inherited this legacy months ago. The battle had forged something stronger than mere ownership. It had created an understanding of the responsibility that comes with justice, and the power that emerges when ordinary people refuse to be victims. The circle closed where it began, on the rolling hills of land that had been returned to its rightful stewardship. But the person standing here now was not the same one who had inherited this legacy months ago. The battle had forged something stronger than mere ownership. It had created an understanding of the responsibility that comes with justice and the power that emerges when principle meets determination. Margaret Walsh's former mansion, now repurposed as the Henderson Family Legal Aid Foundation, stood as a monument to the consequences of underestimating ordinary people who refuse to be victims. The foundation provided free legal assistance to families facing HOA abuse, property theft, and institutional bullying. What had once been a symbol of ill-gotten wealth now served as a beacon of hope for those who thought they had nowhere to turn. The response was overwhelming. Within 6 months, we had helped more than 50 families across Tennessee and neighboring states fight back against corrupt homeowner associations. Legal victories multiplied as other communities found the courage to challenge institutional abuse that had operated in darkness for years. The conservation easement protecting my 1,500 acres ensured that the wilderness would never again face the threat of unauthorized development. Future generations would walk the same trails my grandfather had shown me as a child, breathing the same clean air and finding the same peace that had sustained our family through decades of change. But the most important legacy was not legal or environmental. It was the proof that justice exists for those brave enough to demand it, patient enough to pursue it, and strong enough to see it through to the end. Margaret Walsh had built her criminal empire on the assumption that ordinary people would never have the resources or determination to challenge institutional power. She was wrong about more than just my resources. She was wrong about the fundamental nature of justice itself. She believed that wealth and connections could overcome truth and law. She thought that fear and isolation would always triumph over courage and unity. She assumed that her victims would remain silent, scattered, and defeated. Every assumption was shattered by the simple decision to fight back. Every prediction proved false when individual suffering transformed into collective action. Every threat became meaningless when people who had lost everything discovered they still had the power to demand justice. The letters continue to arrive from families who found hope in our story. Parents who refused to let HOA bullies steal their children's future. Elderly couples who discovered they were not too old to fight institutional corruption. Young families who learned that owning property means more than paying mortgages and following rules written by people who do not have their best interests at heart. This was never just about recovering stolen land. It was about proving that the American dream of property ownership means nothing without the courage to defend it against those who would take it through fraud, intimidation, and abuse of power. Standing on these hills as the sun sets over wilderness that will remain wild forever, I understand that my grandfather's greatest gift was not the land itself. It was an example of what it means to be a steward of something larger than yourself, to protect what cannot protect itself, to fight for what is right, even when the fight seems impossible. Margaret Walsh thought she was stealing land. She was wrong. She was creating warriors.